Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from The Bunker, and in this video we need to talk about data, specifically the way data is collected by Jehovah's Witnesses when they call at your door. So assuming you've never been a Jehovah's Witness, you might be wondering what the process is from the witness perspective when someone contacts you at your doorstep. So let's go through three scenarios. The first scenario being a Jehovah's Witness calls at your door and you tell them that you're not interested. Well, in that scenario, basically no real data will get collected unless you make it clear that you don't want to be contacted again. So you can, if you want to, say, please never call at my door again, in which case witnesses will make a note of your address and do their very best not to contact you again. But if you just say, look, I'm not interested or I'm too busy, witnesses will do their best to overcome that objection, but mostly they'll just move on. So that's one scenario, you're not interested. Second scenario, you're not at home. Now, if you're not at home when the witnesses call, typically, I say typically because this is what they want to do and are doing in countries like America, and until recently in the UK, but we'll get to that. If you're not at home, the witnesses will make a note of your address so that they can try again. So on a piece of paper, let's say you live at number 32 Jones Lane or something, they'll make a note of that address along with other addresses where people haven't been home, and they'll try again. At least some data is collected. The third scenario, in which a lot of data gets collected, is if you express any kind of interest or give witnesses any indication at all that you might be interested in what they have to offer. So Jehovah's Witnesses call at your door and you have a conversation, and perhaps you accept some literature, or you otherwise entertain a conversation that gives them hope that you are someone who might be interested long term at some point in studying with them. Here's where it gets interesting because they make a note of all of that. So they will disappear from your doorstep, usually around the corner, somewhere where you can't see where they are. Maybe they'll get in their car if their car is nearby, or at least round the back of a tree or a hedge or whatever. And they will get their notebook out and they will write down your name if you gave it to them, a few notes about your situation. They'll usually make a note of your gender, your family setup. If they notice there were children, they'll maybe say has children. They'll make a note of your religious status. So if you mentioned that you were Catholic, for example, they'll write down Catholic. If you said you were an atheist, they'll write down atheist. Basically any personal details that they can remember that they would find useful in calling again to jog their memory, to restart the conversation, or to advance the dialogue to the point where you could entertain the thought of becoming a witness, they will write that down. Now, right up until the 1990s, I think it was around the 1990s, in the UK, we as witnesses, I say we because I was once a witness, we used this form, and it's called a house-to-house record, or S8. It says S8 just in the corner there. Most forms, or nearly all forms that witnesses use, even letters, have an S number attached. So this is an S8 house-to-house record, and you'll see there that at the top it says street, territory number. So territories are just like a group of streets or maybe a couple of blocks that the publisher is assigned to work. The publisher's name, a publisher, incidentally, you might be wondering what's all this talk about publisher. A publisher is a Jehovah's Witness, either baptized or unbaptized, who is authorized to represent the congregation in the preaching work. So that's what a publisher is. You then have symbols. So these are, you can see there, the column heading is symbol. So you have call again, not home, busy, child, man, or woman. So straight away, you can see that there's data being collected here. It also allows people to write down, if you look in the furthest column, the name, placement, and remarks. So there your name, as you divulged it, will be written down. Any literature that you took will be written down. Any remarks you made will be written down. And as I mentioned, this includes anything you said about your family or your background or your religious views. All of that would be included in that column. Now, as I mentioned, they stopped using this form in the UK in the 90s because of data protection laws. Because in the UK, it's long been the case that you don't get to hold information, private information on an individual without their consent. That's been the case in the UK for a number of years now. And in the 90s, we were told as witnesses that we were no longer to use the S8 form, but we could, if we wanted to, keep exactly the same information just in our own handwritten notes. And you can actually write more in handwritten notes than these forms, because these forms are actually quite restrictive in how much space they allow you. But in handwritten notes, you can write a novel about what someone's said to you. So that's where we were up to as of when I left the UK in, 2009. I left the UK to move to Croatia. And as far as I know, it's been that way all the way up to now. And I'm coming to the main part where we talk about how things have changed. But I wanted to explain all of that to you, just to highlight what a big deal these changes will be, because basically witnesses in the UK no longer get to keep any information about conversations that they're having. And I've been through all of this information now, so that those of you who are watching my channel who've never been witnesses and who are total outsiders, so that you understand what witness culture is when it comes to data and how invasive witness culture is in accumulating information about, but basically total strangers. Quite detailed information about what they think and their personal lives. Witnesses in an ideal world would be freely gathering, but in Europe, there's a little thing called the GDPR. The GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. We actually covered this in a Watchtower in Focus episode around the time that it was implemented. It's actually implemented on the 25th of May 2018. These are stringent laws aimed at stopping organizations from freely gathering information and sharing it as however they see fit without the permission of the individuals whose data they are collecting, namely the data subjects. And in order to enforce this GDPR, these regulations, hefty fines are threatened. So if you're an organization found in breach of GDPR, you could potentially pay, I forget what the exact percentage is of your revenue, but it's potentially running into the many thousands of dollars. So you can see why there would be a clash between the way Jehovah's Witnesses, their kind of slapdash way of gathering any data that they feel is relevant to them, and modern rules that justifiably protect people's privacy and people's information. So as a result of these GDPR regulations, well, first of all, when they were initially being implemented, as we covered in the Watchtower in Focus show, Watchtower, well, they first of all only seem to think this applied to how they gather their information on Jehovah's Witnesses who attend the meetings. So they issued this notice and consent for use of personal data throughout the congregations. As far as I know, this went out throughout the EEA, or European Economic Area. And here's the part I want you to look at in particular. It says, upon becoming a publisher, I acknowledge that the worldwide religious organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, including my congregation, local branch office, and similar cooperating organizations of Jehovah's Witnesses, lawfully uses my personal data in accordance with its legitimate religious interests. Additionally, I consent to the use of my personal data so that I may participate in some religious activities in connection with my worship, and so that I may receive spiritual support. I also agree that my personal data may be sent to any of the cooperating organizations of Jehovah's Witnesses which may be located in countries whose laws provide different levels of data protection that are not always equivalent to the level of data protection in the country in which I currently reside. What that's saying is, I'm giving my congregation permission to send my data to America, where they have set up in the last few months a new system called Publisher ID, whereby the information on every single publisher, every single Jehovah's Witness who is permitted to represent the congregation in the preaching work, it contains all of the information that they may submit to Watchtower. And obviously, America isn't beholden directly to the GDPR regulations. So currently in America, organizations can, well, I don't know what the precise rules are on privacy, but I think it's safe to say that the rules there are far more lax and far more flexible than they are in Europe, and in my view need to be updated. But anyway, this is the form that witnesses had to sign. It was handed around last year. There's another document that was sent out to elders titled Instructions for Use of Personal Data. And there's an interesting section titled Refusal to Consent. Here's the part that I find interesting. If consent for the use of personal data is not provided, the affected individual may remain a publisher, baptized or unbaptized, and the congregation may keep his personal data related to his activity as a publisher, including the information recorded on the congregation's publisher record or S21 card. However, the individual should be informed that the congregation or branch office may not be able to evaluate his suitability to fill certain roles within the congregation or participate in many congregation activities, such as serving as a regular pioneer, a ministerial servant, or an elder. So what this amounted to was basically delivering an ultimatum. You're going to sign this consent form, and if you refuse, you don't get to ever be a regular pioneer, a ministerial servant, or an elder. I think there were also ramifications about going to international conventions and that kind of thing, which would require Watchtower to have and store information. So this is how Watchtower initially responded to the GDPR regulations, by assuming that it only affected publishers or Jehovah's Witnesses who were engaged in the preaching work. It responded by making them sign a form saying that they could basically send the data to America, and backed up with, you could say, the threat of, if you don't do this, there will be consequences. You won't be able to do some of the many things that materials, our propaganda materials, say that you should be reaching out for if you take the religion seriously. That's a whole other issue. But what's happened recently is that Watchtower has realized that the GDPR regulations go even further than how they manage the data of their followers. They also affect this habits that I alluded to earlier or explained earlier of invasively capturing the data of members of the public to quite an intrusive degree without their consent. So what's happened now is a letter has gone out. Let's see, the date there is May 13th, 2019, which is actually when I'm recording this video, and I'm going to try and get it out today, May 13th, 2019. To all congregations in Britain and Ireland, I understand, or I can't see why this wouldn't also go out to congregations elsewhere in Europe in the EEA or European Economic Area. Regarding General Data Protection Regulation or GDPR, dear brothers, sharing in the field ministry has always been a personal expression of each Christian's faith and desire to preach the good news of God's kingdom. Over the years, you may have become accustomed to collecting personal data in connection with your ministry. However, recent court decisions and the enactment of the General Data Protection Regulation affect the collection and use of personal data in our branch territory. And again, sorry, the date on this is May 13th, 2019. And we're talking about a regulation that came into force on the 25th of May, 2018. So it's taken them a year to issue this letter. Okay, continue. Thus, any suggestions we previously made on note-taking as related to the field ministry are no longer applicable. And it quotes there Romans 13, verse 1. And Romans 13 verse 1 says, "Let every person be in subjection to the superior authorities, for there is no authority except by God. The existing authorities stand placed in their relative positions by God." Apparently, Watchtower is willing to yield to the requirements and recommendations of the superior authorities when it comes to how data is managed, bearing in mind the implications in terms of fines for a simple breach, for any kind of breach of the regulations, but they're not quite willing to subject themselves to the superior authorities in case after case where a state has required them to report child sex abuse, and instead of reporting it to the authorities, they've been found covering it up, as we saw in Montana, where Watchtower was fined $35 million for quite malevolently, and I think the word malice was used, for going against what the local rules were. Apparently, Watchtower is quite flexible in how it applies this verse at Romans 13, verse 1. Anyway, back to the letter. Accordingly, publishers should not collect personal data in connection with the field ministry, and that line is in bold. This means not maintaining records that include a person's name, address, language, ethnicity, and so forth. It also includes not recording addresses where no one is at home. So you'll remember earlier I said, even if you're not at home, at least some information gets noted down so that witnesses can try and call on you again. Even that must now stop. I can imagine lots of elders reading this thinking, finally, because that was one of the most annoying, tedious things when you were leading witnesses in the preaching work. If you were the elder responsible for the group, you'd have to, at the end of the day, say, does anyone have their not at homes? Can you give me your not at homes, please? And you'd have to collate them all together, these crappy bits of paper, scruffy, crumpled bits of paper you'd have to collect together for the next time you tried to contact people, and then cross off those numbers as you got them in. It was really tedious. Now elders don't have to do that because Watchtower is being brought to heel by Satan's system of things in the way it collects data. So the letter continues, though no personal data is recorded, publishers are encouraged to cultivate the interest they find. So this is what they're supposed to do instead of keeping invasive notes about total strangers. A publisher could do so by 1. Providing his contact information to the interested person and arranging a return visit. 2. Directing the interested person to the address of the nearest congregation meetings. Or 3. Directing the person to jw.org. I love how optimistic these recommendations are. So the first point is basically saying, without taking down loads of notes, just, remember where the house is and arrange to call back. Just don't write anything down. But points 2 and 3 are trust that the person is interested enough to come to your local Kingdom Hall or go on jw.org. I can fully imagine people saying, yes, I'm totally going to go on jw.org. Thank you for that recommendation. And the letter concludes, as an exception, if a householder requests that no further visits be made to his home, the publisher should make a note of the date and address only and place it in the territory record so that publishers working the territory in the future will not call at that address, which is what I alluded to earlier. You can, if you want to, insist that witnesses not call at your home. Now, this is the part of the letter that goes out. This is to be read at the very next congregation meeting. And again, the date today is May the 13th. Today is a Monday. Depending on where, on the time slot, on when witnesses will have their meetings, and I'm not aware of many having their meetings on a Monday. This letter hasn't even been read out yet at Kingdom Hall meetings. It will be read out or start to be read out during the course of this week. But you're actually, assuming you're watching this on May the 13th, you're getting this information before witnesses are getting it, which make of that what you will. But there's actually a postscript to the letter that's just for elders. It says, P.S. to bodies of elders. The coordinator of the body of elders should arrange for this letter to be read to the congregation at the first midweek meeting after its receipt. Thereafter, it should be posted on the information board for 1 month. This postscript should neither be read to the congregation nor be posted on the information board. I find it fascinating the way that information isn't just transparently available to all. You have this, eyes-only information. And it's basically going on to talk about how the elders should go through the territory map cards, which again just spell out what the territory is or how many blocks it is, and just make sure that these don't include any personal data of any particular people who live on that territory. I think this would be particularly of relevance in foreign language congregations where they're far more dependent on knowing, let's say, for example, there is a house on a street where the family speaks Arabic and it's an Arabic congregation. They're going to want to know where that family is and the fact that they speak Arabic, and that's personal information. So that's what it's kind of referring to here, I think. But that's more or less what the new guidelines are. And again, I cannot express enough what a huge thing this is. It's difficult to understand if you've never been a witness, which is why I spent so much time at the beginning of this video explaining the role of data collection in the preaching work of witnesses. If you've spent time as a witness, you'll know what a big thing this is. This completely changes the way witnesses in Europe will henceforth be doing their ministry. It will now be simply a case of, okay, we're working door to door and we're just going to hope people are in. Because if they're not in, we can't record the not homes. And if they are in, we've got to achieve as much as possible on that first call, because we're limited in how much information, or we can't record any information. We can offer to come back, but if we do that, we can't write down any information that has already been discussed or divulged. This will be a big deal for witnesses, and again, it's entirely forced upon Watchtower by improvements, by modern standards of privacy, and making sure that organizations don't get to hold personal information on people, which has just gone on for way too long. Again, in America, it seems that they are slow to implement this sort of legislation, but it wouldn't surprise me if eventually Jehovah's Witnesses in America have the same restrictions placed on their preaching work, and already the GDPR regulations are to some extent a worry for Watchtower in America, because again, that's where they keep their publisher ID system, where they keep the information of all witnesses internationally, including witnesses accused of crimes like child sex abuse, but that's a whole other story. Apparently Watchtower, while quoting Romans 13 verse 1 about obeying the superior authorities, sees nothing wrong in keeping a list of criminals that they refuse to notify the authorities of. So that's the news that I wanted to share. Again, a big deal in the Jehovah's Witness community. Let me know what you think in the comments below, especially if you've been a witness, or if you currently are a witness perhaps. Let me know what effect you think this will have on a congregation level. But that's pretty much everything I wanted to share with you. I hope you found this information useful. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos, and as always, thank you for watching.